My name is Jeremy Angstedt, and I'm the Museum Services Manager for the Sandusky Library and Fallen House Museum. Today we're going to go on a cemetery walk of Oakland Cemetery, and we're going to focus on soldiers who were from Erie County who died during World War I. We thought this would be a fitting cemetery walk to do in light of Memorial Day upcoming, so we hope you all enjoy it. This is the grave of Edward Miller. Edward Miller was born April 6, 1897 in Marblehead. He was the son of Arthur and Anna Miller. Unfortunately, 3 years after his birth in 1900, his father Arthur died. A year after that, his mother Anna remarried to Herman Nagel. Herman worked as a farmer and then later as a lime kiln worker. With this marriage, he got one younger sister named Norma. Edward worked as a fireman on one of the ships on the lake, but we don't know what ship it was. Edward Miller was drafted on September 4th, 1918. He was assigned to the 1st Training Battalion, 158th Depot Brigade down at Camp Sherman. Camp Sherman was a training camp located just outside of Chillicothe here in Ohio. Unfortunately, while he was at Camp Sherman, he got typhoid fever and he died on October 6, 1918. 2 days later, his body arrived here in Sandusky. And then 2 days after that, on October 10th, they had a funeral, first at the house of his uncle's home, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Stevens, and then at St. Mary's Church. They had a full mass for him at St. Mary's, and then they decided to intern him here at the family plot at Oakland. So we're going to head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Harold Blanc. He was born January 10th, 1900 here in Perkins Township. He was the son of Ernest and Carrie Blanc. His father, Ernest, worked in a stone quarry as a teamster. He was the oldest of 5 siblings, having 2 brothers and 2 sisters. On July 7, 1915, he enlisted in the 6th Ohio. The 6th Ohio is basically like a National Guard unit. Once the United States entered World War I, the 6th Ohio was called out to guard against saboteurs. So in April 1917, he was in Port Clinton guarding one of the railroad bridges. On April 15, 1917, around 10 p.m., Harold went to relieve a soldier who was on guard duty near the bridge of the New York Central Railroad. While he was doing that, he was struck by a train and killed instantly. His body, of course, was brought back to Sandusky, and services were held at one of the local funeral homes, the Andres and Fry Funeral Home, on April 17th, and then later in the day at the Zion Lutheran Church. The body was escorted from the church to the cemetery here by the unit he was a part of, the 6th Ohio. During the burial, they played taps and fired a ceremonial salute. A lot of the different civic organizations came out to honor him. The GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, which was a Civil War Veterans Organization, Boy Scouts, and a couple other organizations. He was the first soldier to be killed during World War I who was from Erie County. Afterwards, 2 years later actually, in December of 1919, his mother sued the New York City Railroad Company because she blamed that they didn't follow proper protocols, and that's the reason that her son died. She sued them for $20,000. The case lasted 3 days, and unfortunately they ruled against his mother. And with that, we're going to head on over to the next site. This is the grave of John Rice. John Rice was born October 31st, 1888 here in Sandusky, Ohio. His parents were Jacob and Augusta Rice. John was the oldest sibling. He had 5 younger sisters. His father, Jacob, worked as a brewer in town and was originally from Germany, but his father unfortunately died in 1905. On November 21st, 1913, he enlisted as part of the Coastal Artillery. The Coastal Artillery was a part of the United States Army that their job was to protect the coasts of the United States from enemy ships. He was stationed in Fort Worden, Washington until June of 1918. In June of 1918, he was discharged with 100% disability due to the tuberculosis that he acquired while he was out there. He was admitted to the Sandusky Soldier Home of January of 1919 and stayed there until March. He was actually the first soldier from World War I to go to the Soldiers Home here in Sandusky. On May 12, 1919, he unfortunately died at home from tuberculosis. The funeral was held May 15th, and then they buried him here. And with that, we'll go to the next grave. This is a grave of Clarence Poppy. Clarence Poppy was born here in Sandusky on February 11th, 1897. to parents Albert and Maud. His father, Albert, worked as a foreman at the American Crayon Factory in downtown Sandusky. Clarence had two older siblings, Charles and Irene. Clarence worked as a tinner here in Sandusky. He enlisted into the Army on September 4th, 1918. He was originally assigned to the 1st Training Battalion, 158th Depot Brigade at Camp Sherman, the training camp down by Chillicothe. He got sick around September 13th. He's progressively got worse. On October 8th, his family got a telegraph about him being seriously sick. His parents and his sister traveled to his sick bed. They are able to get there before he dies, but he dies on October 11th, 1918. The next day, his body is brought back here to Sandusky and taken to his parents' house. On October 15th, they have a funeral at the home, and they have a funeral service for him out here in Sandusky. And with that, we'll go on to the next grave. This is the grave of James White. James White was born July 23rd, 1893 here in Sandusky, Ohio, to parents Julia and Melvin White. Melvin worked as a fisherman here in town. James had one younger brother named Harold. James worked a lot of different places here in Sandusky. He worked at the paper mill for a while. He worked for the electric package company as a manager for a while. Later on, he worked for the electric Lakeshore Railroad. On October 5th, 1917, he was drafted into the Army. He was sent down to Camp Sherman, down near Chillicothe, for training. Then he was sent to Texas for a while, then down to North Carolina, then up to Camp Merritt in New Jersey. Finally, in July of 1918, he was sent over to France as part of the 18th Infantry Regiment. He was stationed near St. Méhy in France. He took part in the Battle of St. Méhy in September of 1918 as part of the Meuse-Argonne campaign. He was killed in action on October 4th, 1918, early in the campaign. His family, though, wasn't notified till November 21st that he was missing in action, and it isn't until February 13th of 1919 that he is finally said to be killed in action. He is originally buried in one of the American cemeteries in France, but in September of 1921, his body is brought back to the States. In 1920 and 1921, there was an effort to bring bodies back of soldiers who were buried in American cemeteries in France and in Europe to be brought home to be buried in their family plots. So his body was brought from France on a ship to New York City, and then from New York it went to Columbus, and then from Columbus up here to Sandusky. Services were held for him on October 3rd, 1921, first at his parents' house and then at the Calvary Episcopal Church here in town. The American Legion helped with the funeral and fired the salute and everything. So with that, we'll go on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Nelson Gaius. He was born December 21st, 1896 here in Sandusky, Ohio, to parents John and Catherine Gaius. He was the third of 4 children. He had 2 older brothers and 1 younger sister. His father worked as a teamster here in Sandusky. Nelson worked as a machinist at the Hoffman Coal and Milling Company. On September 4th, 1918, he enlisted into the Army, and he was sent down to Camp Sherman down by Chillicothe for training. He was assigned to the 1st Training Battalion, 158th Depot Brigade, then eventually assigned to the 166th Rainbow Division. He died on October 5th, 1918 in Camp Sherman from Spanish flu. His body was sent back here to Sandusky to his parents' house, where they had a funeral for him there, and then they had another funeral for him at Grace Episcopal Church. And then they brought him out here for interment. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Austin Atwood. Austin Atwood was born September 2nd, 1896 here in Sandusky to George and Mary Atwood. His father, George, was an engineer on the railroad here in town. He had one sister named Mildred who was 2 years younger than him. Austin, before he entered the service, was training to be a plumber. On June 22nd, 1917, he enlisted to be part of the Coast Patrol, kind of a precursor to the Coast Guard. It was still part of the U.S. Navy at the time. He was stationed aboard the USS Michigan down the Chesapeake Bay. On November 2nd, 1917, he was part of a training exercise in a small boat when the boat sank, and he was one of 12 men on the boat who all died. His father, George, traveled to Baltimore to try and help recover his body. They originally had a memorial service for him on November 4th at the Calvary Church here in town, and his body was not recovered until November 14th. 4 days later, they brought his body back here to Sandusky, and on November 20th, they held a private service first at his home and then out at the Calvary Church. His parents asked for no patriotic demonstrations. None of the civic organizations came out. They just had a very quiet funeral for him. In November of 1919, Calvary Episcopal Church held a service honoring those who died in the war who were from their church, and to honor them, they ended up planting 3 trees for the 3 members of their church who died: Austin Atwood, James White, and Maurice Platt. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Clarence Howard. He was born May 13th, 1896 in Detroit, Michigan. He was raised here in Sandusky by his grandmother, Abby Howard. He worked as a bellboy at the Commercial Hotel here in downtown, and he also played on one of the local baseball teams, the Sandusky Crescents. He was drafted on October of 1917, and he was assigned to the 350th Machine Gun Battalion. Now, 350 Machine Gun Battalion was a all African American regiment. At the time, the U.S. Army was not integrated, so they had all African American regiments. He did very well. He was promoted up to corporal, and he was eventually sent over to France and stationed in the Flanders area. On October 12, 1918, he was part of an accident. He was lighting his pipe from one of the stoves in camp when the cook who was cleaning his pistol accidentally shot him in the head. He was taken to the hospital, but unfortunately died that day. It wouldn't be until November 21st that his grandmother was notified. He was buried in a cemetery over in France, and then in July of 1921, he was part of 131 soldiers' bodies who were shipped back to the States to be buried. They held a service for him at the African Methodist Episcopal Church here in Sandusky. The American Legion gave him full honors at both the church and here at the cemetery, and he was the first soldier buried in the American Legion lot. So the American Legion lot where we're standing was originally set aside for soldiers who served in World War I, and they would be buried here. The city went through a lot of different changes of who would be allowed to bury here and who wasn't. They actually were passing laws on the lot up until 1948, so it took them a while to decide what would happen. So with that, we'll head on over to our next grave. This is the grave of Rufus T Smith. He was the son of Albert R. Smith and was born here in Sandusky. He had one brother who served in the 223rd Infantry Regiment in France as a sergeant. Rufus himself enlisted in the Army in May of 1917. He was first sent to Camp Washington and then transferred to a munitions plant down in Charleston, West Virginia. Somewhere around August 17th, he became ill with, we think, the Spanish flu, and he died a week later on August 24th, 1918. His body arrived here on August 29th, and he was taken to one of the local funeral homes, the Andres Fry Funeral Home, and they originally interred him in the public part of the Sandusky Oakland Cemetery. It was a part where if you couldn't afford a grave, they would bury you, but there were no tombstones. He was reinterred on November 14th, 1921, just like the last person we talked about, part of the American Legion lot. For some reason, though, when they reinterred him, they did not give him a headstone, unfortunately. But we do know he is buried here in this lot. With that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Morris Platt. He was born here in Sandusky on September 17th, 1891, son of Adolph and Mary Platt. He had 4 brothers and 3 sisters. Unfortunately, his father died in 1909, and after that, he went to go live with his uncle. He married his wife, Elsie Rom being her maiden name, in 1911. In Sandusky, he worked as a machine hand for the city ice delivery company. He also played baseball for one of the local teams called the Shamrocks, and he played as the pitcher. He enlisted in the Army on July 28, 1918, first being sent down to Camp Sherman near Chillicothe for training, and then in September of 1918, he was sent out to Fort Benjamin Harrison. He was part of the engineers out there. On October 9th, 1918, unfortunately, he died of some illness. We're not sure what. His obituary says that he was promoted while he was there, but in his military records, we can't find anything that actually says he was promoted. So they sent his body back here, arrived here on October 12th, and they had a funeral on October 14th. First ceremony at their home, and then another one at Calvary Episcopal. He was interned here in Oakland Cemetery at the family plot, but eventually re-interned here at the American Legion lot. And with that, we'll go to the next grave. This is the grave of Emil Strickler. Emil was born in January of 1895 in Troy, Ohio. His parents were Laura and William Strickler. Somewhere between 1895 and 1897, his mother dies and his father remarries Cora. After that, we know in 1900 that he is living with his aunt and uncle William and Lucinda Smith. His aunt unfortunately dies in 1902. He enlists in the Army on May 29, 1918. It has a short training and is sent to France either in July or September of 1918. He is assigned to the 61st Infantry Regiment. They were part of the Meuse-Argonne section in the American line, and he was part of the offensive. We're not sure when, but we do know he was wounded, probably somewhere in November. There's a letter in the newspaper from their chaplain that says he sank rapidly. He was sent to one of the base hospitals, and he died on November 11th, 1918 from his wounds. His stepmother is informed, we know, in December of 1918, and she received letters from the chaplain, which I mentioned was published in the newspaper, and the Red Cross. Interestingly enough, we know that Emil left a $10,000 life insurance policy to his stepmother, and she received $57.50 a month for till the $10,000 would be gone. On December 20th, his body arrives in New York City in 1920. January 13th, his body arrives here in Sandusky. It's taken to the home of his stepmother and her new husband. They held a funeral for him at the Salem Evangelical Church on January 17, 1921. They actually have a military funeral for him on the graveside with the American Legion here with a bugler and a 21-gun salute. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is a grave of John Nupp. John Nupp was born here in Sandusky in 1892. His parents were Gustav and Helen Nupp, both originally from Germany. They owned a farm out in Perkins Township. Nupp had three brothers, George, Harry, and Fred. His brother Harry also enlisted in the military, served in France, wounded, and survived. John enlisted in 1914. He was originally part of the 34th Infantry Regiment, part of the supply company. He ended up becoming the first sergeant of their unit, so he was a very good soldier. He was stationed down in Fort Bliss, Texas. On May 31st, 1917, he died from scarlet fever. His body arrived here in town on June 5th, 1917. They held a private funeral for him at the Andres and Fry Funeral Home, and the body was escorted from the funeral home to the cemetery by the 6th Ohio Infantry, and they held a full military service for him here at his grave. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Gaius McDowell. He was born December 26, 1896 here in Sandusky, Ohio, son of Claude and Martha McDowell. Unfortunately, his mother died in 1907. Gaius attended Sandusky High School and actually played on the football team. When he was younger, he was also a member of a civic organization called Children of the Republic. It was started by the Daughters of the American Revolution to promote patriotism in children. He worked as an engineer on one of the ferries that Cedar Point operated. He entered the Navy on May of 1918, and he trained to be a naval engineer. And he married his wife Isabel Link in August of September of 1918. After he finished training, he became an ensign. He was stationed on the East Coast, traveled between Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore. Unfortunately, on January 19, 1919, he died of Spanish flu. His body arrived here in town on January 22nd, accompanied by a naval escort. He was taken to one of the local undertaking establishments, Marquette Undertaking, where they brought him here for a military funeral. He was laid to rest in a regulation coffin. That was a big part of his obituary, so we figured wanted to make sure that we included in this. And the members of the Marine Engineers Guild were present at the ceremony. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is a grave of Lee P. McGill. He was born December 11th, 1896 in Parkertown, Ohio. He was the son of Pearson and Mabel McGill. We know he had one younger sister named Esther. Pearson worked as a day laborer here in town, Lee worked as an electrician at the Heyden-Dowk Paper Company. At some point in time, he married Lucille Roth, but we're not exactly sure when. He enlisted in the Army on September 4th, 1918, and he was sent down to Camp Sherman for training. On October 3rd, his family is notified that he is very ill with the Spanish flu. His sister and mother rushed down to be on his bedside, and unfortunately he dies on October 4th, 1918 from the Spanish flu. His body arrived back here on October 6th or October 7th, and on October 8th they had a service for him at their home and an internment out here at Oakland Cemetery. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Lester Counts. He was born October 7th, 1889 here in Sandusky, son of Carl and Eva Counts. He married his wife Clara Holtzmiller in 1912. They ended up having 3 children together, Donald, Dorothy, and George. Unfortunately, their son George died 2 months after his father. He was 1 year old. In 1915, we know Lester was arrested and taken to Cleveland for having stolen goods from a store there. We know in June of 1916, he joined the Ohio National Guard's 6th Ohio. In March 1917, he was on guard at a railroad station near Hayes Avenue, guarding the New York Central Railroad Company. He saw a suspicious man and ordered him to stop 3 different times. The man started running after the 3rd warning, and Lester shot him. Lester was arrested but investigated, but showed that he was right in shooting him. We know somewhere around April 1917 he left the 6th Ohio and started working at the Ferrell Cheek Steel Foundry Company here in Sandusky as a molder. In May 28, 1918, he re-enlisted in the military and he was stationed at Camp McClellan down in Alabama. In June of 1918, he was promoted to sergeant, and then in July of 1918, he was demoted back down to private. He was part of the supply company, part of the ammunition train. Sometime in October of 1918, he got the Spanish flu. His parents got a message to come down to be at his bedside because they weren't sure how long he would live. Unfortunately, on October 20th, 1918, he died. His parents arrived the next day on the 21st. On the 23rd, his parents arrived back here in town with his body, and they had a private funeral for him at his parents' home, and then he was interred here. And with that, we'll go to the next grave. This is the grave of Edward Roth. He was born in Sandusky on May 24th, 1893, to Frank and Emma Roth. His father, Frank, worked as a carpenter here in town. Edward had 3 younger brothers, Chester, Franklin, and Frederick. Edward worked as a machinist and engraver at the Matthews Engraving Company here in town. On October 5th, 1917, he enlisted in the Army. He was assigned to the 136th Machine Gun Battalion down in Camp Sheridan. He was discharged on June 19th, 1918 for medical problems. He had chronic kidney problems that developed while he was in the Army. He was sent back here to Sandusky, and he died at the Good Samaritan Hospital on June 24th, 1919. There was a funeral held for him at his parents' house on June 27th, and he was buried here at Oakland Cemetery. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Wawasee Haim. He was born January 8th, 1892 here in Sandusky, to the parents Christian and Agnes Haim. His father, Christian, was a fireman of the Jericho Chemical Company. He was the oldest sibling. He had 3 younger sisters and 1 younger brother. Lowell himself also worked at the Jericho Chemical Company as a clerk. He enlisted in the Army on November 3rd, 1917, and was assigned to the 17th Field Artillery. He was stationed in France between Paris and Rheims. He served during the Battle of Belleau Woods. During that battle, a bomb fell in his tent and wounded him on July 20th, 1918. Later that same day, he died. His family was notified on August 4th. The same day, the flag at the Jericho Chemical Company was lowered to half-staff in honor of him. On August 11th, they held a service for him at the First Baptist Church here in Sandusky. At the time, they thought he was the first Erie County soldier to be killed during the war, but they were wrong. We didn't know about Elmer yet. On January 1921, his family is notified that his body is being shipped back to the States for reburial, and his father travels to New York to meet the body. On January 18th, his father and Lola Hunt's body returned here to Sandusky. On January 20th, they held a service for him at First Baptist Church, and they interred him here at Oakland Cemetery. The Sandusky Veterans Foreign War Post is actually named after Wawasee Haim. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Elmer Reese. He was born August 12, 1896 in Niles, Ohio, to Thomas and Mary Reese. He had one brother, Howard. Somewhere between 1896 and 1900, his father Thomas died, and his mother remarried to John Jenkins. After their remarriage, they moved to Newcastle, Pennsylvania for a while, and then Elmer moved back to the Sandusky area, along with his mother. He worked for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad as a brakeman. In May 19, 1917, he enlisted in the Marines. On November 30, 1917, he was promoted up to corporal and assigned to the 6th Regiment of Marines. On February 12, 1918, he was sent to France. He took part in the Battle of Belle Woods near the Marne River in France. He was killed in action on June 8, 1918. He was the first soldier from Erie County to be killed in action during World War I. His family actually received a letter from him on May 28th, and the family wasn't notified until September 20th, 1918. The reason for the delay was the Marines took heavy losses during that battle, somewhere between 50 to 70% of all men. Because of this, it took a while to find out and notify all the families who died. That evening, when they received the letter, they had a memorial service held at one of the local churches. On November 17th, a memorial service was held in honor of Elmer at the German Reformed Church. On August 9, 1921, Mary Jenkins was informed the body of her son, Elmer, was being shipped back to the States for reburial. The body arrived in New York City, and it came to here by train. It arrived here in Sandusky on September 12th, and it was taken to his mother's home. The funeral was conducted at the home by the American Legion. The Marines from his unit came out to be pallbearers, and taps was played at the gravesite here when they reinterred his body at this cemetery. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Walter Theodore Hall. He was born August 12, 1896 here in Sandusky to John and Minnie Path. They were married in 1896. Sometime after his mother died, Minnie, Walter was sent to go live with the Halls, his grandparents. His grandparents were Theodore and Mary Hall. His grandfather Theodore worked as a carpenter. Walter worked as a core maker in a foundry, making casts out of sand. He was drafted August 26, 1918. He was part of the 139th Depot Brigade down at Camp Taylor in Kentucky. On October 6, 1918, he died of Spanish flu. His body was sent back here to Sandusky by train. They had one service at their house and another service at the First Christian Church. On October 10, 1918, they buried his body here in Sandusky. During World War I, 56 soldiers from Erie County died. 26 died of illness, 22 died from combat-related deaths, 3 died from accidents, and 5 died from unknown reasons. We know the first death came on April 14, 1917. The first combat death came on June 18, 1918. October was a particularly hard month for Erie County. 28, or exactly half of the soldiers who died from Erie County during World War I died in October of 1918. The last combat-related death was on November 11, 1918, incidentally the last day of the war. And the last Army-related death from World War I was May 24, 1919. Thank you for joining us for another cemetery walk here at Oakland Cemetery, and we hope to see you soon.